Okay, let's do one of these book things. Now, I read so slowly now. Again, I had hopes that in my retirement I would be doing a lot of reading and a lot of walking. That hasn't happened. I've done a lot of fucking Raid Shadow Legends. That may change. I don't know. Because I've got other ways of drowning myself out that are more effective and stronger, but less scheduled. And that may be my off-ramp, if I can fucking give it up. This one is about Dean Acheson. It's by James Chase. It's a biography. It's a little weird because it's the only biography of Acheson, but he wrote a couple of autobiography or autobiographical books, memoirs, and the first one he wrote was about his pre-government time, which is kind of like, gosh, unless you're running for office nowadays, nobody really gives a shit about that kind of stuff, right? They want the whole thing or they want nothing. But then after he retired completely, well, more or less, because up until his death, he was still advising presidents and whatnot, even, of different parties, like they ended up advising. Well, he didn't advise Eisenhower much. He advised Nixon during the Nixon presidency a fair amount as sort of an elder statesman who was called in. Remember when our government was such that it was kind of common to call on the other party to help you out, especially with foreign affairs and such not. But almost always to have a cabinet secretary from the other party and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. They've kind of kept up with it. But anyway. As a book, hey, interesting. It covers the material. It seems researched well, like any biography. Well, almost any. The person writing it is going to get so involved in this one person that if they can maintain an interest in them, they probably end up seeing them in a pretty good light. And in the case of this, I have the feeling that maybe the author is attributing too much of the U.S. post-World War II foreign policy to Acheson. Now, Acheson only served as Secretary of State for Truman and not for his entire regime, administration. And in fact, you had a couple before him, but most notably you had Marshall, General Marshall, as Secretary of State for a while. And that's really when the Marshall Plan was put into place. But it, like a lot of the post-World War II America's world, honestly. Now, you could argue that the Cold War wasn't really America's world, that we were a bipolar world with, two competing superpowers, fine. But it felt like more of the world was aligned with the U.S. and more of the world's wealth was sort of operating and directed by the U.S. because in particular Western Europe was entirely under allied with the U.S., etc. And things like the rebuilding of Japan, all the big economies with the exception of the superpower of Russia and then, to a lesser extent, China during this period, were aligned with the U.S. There were third world countries that went that went one way or the other, whoever they could get the better deal from, some non-aligned or kind of third way countries, stuff like India, but they didn't really power it up that heavily. Anyway. So the structures of that sort of Cold War America were really being built up heavily by Acheson. It's kind of funny because his Okay, first off, why is that interesting? Because the Cold War America and that one of two great superpowers is what led into the period of absolute American dominance, say in the 90s and the 2000s, where yes, there's a threat from China growing, but we were extending economic fig leaves or whatever to China. We were helping their economy grow, trying to draw them into that same sort of, hey, look, we're all better off if we all work together. Maybe not in everything, but in terms of trade and in terms of a globalized environment. Now, at this point, we've kind of seen the collapse of all that, and some of it is intentional dismantling by the current administration, and honestly by the previous Trump administration as well, but to a lesser extent, where all the soft power is just being cut away and dropped on the table, where insulting and pushing our allies away from us and actually trying to get more into some sort of rapprochement, perhaps, but it almost feels like it's a heading to try to get to an alliance with Russia, of all places, this weak little economy that just happens to have nuclear weapons, and abandoning the ideals and whatnot that had kind of driven us forward, some of them highly misguided, right? Like the anti-communist at all cost type of ideal or whatever, which led us to do things like support Pinochet and, and cause ourselves all kinds of problems on the world stage in some kind of, well, at least they ain't commies type of attitude. Look, anyway. The point there is that, like, diametrically opposed to the ideology that our greatest enemy has is not enough of a qualification to call for a friendship. And in some cases, there were countries that we could have treated in much, much better circumstances and not driven them into the hands of communism, or not driven them into the hands of the communist states that were our natural enemies, if you want to put it bluntly, or competitors or whatever, depending on how you want to look at it. Had we not taken that ideological, I want to say test, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Had we not sort of demanded an ideological purity and only really the only communist nation we dealt with in the Cold War period was when Nixon turned to China. And even that was not that big in terms of, like, it's not like we became allies with China. It's like we broke China. We took a China that was really untrusting of the Russians and made them a separate player. Gave them room where they're not opposed to both of us automatically. But anyway, we're in a, I don't know why I'm talking about this, but we're now in a position where that's being dismantled. And some of it, like I said, is due to the current administration, but a fair amount of it is honestly due to changes in the Chinese internal politics. China was rising anyway. They managed to basically take advantage of the pro-growth policies that were put in place, say in the 2000s, get all the riches from that, right? But then clamp back down and turn it back into an authoritarian communist or socialist state, where they're not really following those same expansions. They're trying to hold on to them, but the loosening up and whatever that we had hoped had happened, instead we saw a clamping down and a discrediting within China itself of everything that, you know, smacks of ideological impurity. But anyway, it was kind of exciting to me to look at this period at a person who was so integral in building up those structures, which honestly lasted, you know, if you look at it from like 1950 or so, say for at least half a century, probably more, and had massive effects. Now, there are still effects in play, but anyway. What I found really interesting about Acheson was, as a character, was sort of how he morphed. Coming out of, when he was Secretary of State, coming out of World War II, and when he was in, you know, higher positions in the State Department there as well, he had initially a very conciliatory tone towards the Soviets. Now, obviously, Roosevelt did too. Truman, not so much. And but Acheson had sort of a view that we could do things and not end up as enemies or intractable enemies for you know, the next 50 years or whatever. Not quite, 40 years. With a brief respite, and now, well, who the hell knows what now? Because it seems like we're operating in what looks like not our best interests as a country. But anyway, and because of that, that's because we're dismantling this world order that like benefited us greatly in many ways, and maybe you could make arguments, well, look, it benefited Western Europe more than it benefited us. That's possible. But it benefited us more than taking other stances would have. Like, that's the whole thing. We came out ahead compared to other choices, even if other people came out more ahead than we did by our choices. But that seems to be what this administration hates, is like, oh, you know, Europe is able to get away without spending very much of their GDP on military or whatever. And, you know, yeah, it's true, but we all came out better than if we pushed each other and shoved and threw sharp elbows and all kind of shit like that. Which, you know, it becomes clear when you start looking at the tariff situation that would occur with Canada. I don't even know where the hell that is anymore. Like, are they all on delay? Whatever. I have no idea. But it's laughably bad. It's like someone threatening to drink poison if you don't do what they tell you. You know, it's fucking idiotic. Yeah. But anyway, he had a sort of a transition in his period. First of all, decisions that did not go his way helped propel more anti-Soviet policies in the U.S. Decisions to, like, especially with the atomic bomb and certain sharing that wasn't really material by the author's point of view. In some ways, I feel like the author is being a little too sanguine about what Acheson's views were and what would actually happen. We don't know what would have happened, right? Could have gone completely belly up. But also things like supporting China in distancing themselves from Russia as a very early thing. Kind of not supporting Taiwan and letting the Chiang Kai-shek regime fall, but Mao was not quick enough to hitting it, and then eventually U.S. kind of committed itself there, especially after the Korean War. But as time went on, he became more and more a cold warrior. Now, it's kind of funny because one of the things that came out of the Truman administration and his role in that is that he got kind of looked at as a squish on communism coming out of that, but ended up as almost a knee-jerk anti-communist, and to the point where he thought we should, commit ourselves more heavily in Vietnam for a while, although he came around fairly early to the military's fucking lying to us, with the knowledge that was in hand, not with what the public knew. The public was still in support, but he had knowledge of that the military was, blowing smoke and sunshine, and other people with significant stakes in the advisory capacities, etc., and in the administrations themselves, also were like, yeah, the military is just jerking us around, and they're making it sound like they're doing well, and they're not. They're promoting body count instead of, what's actually happening. They're claiming to have killed more Viet Cong than there possibly could have been. Stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to see that transition. That's very late in the book. After, it really kind of happens after he left office. But one of the things that happened in between that, or towards the end of his term in office, was McCarthyism. And he was someone who actually got in a lot of trouble for, not turning his back on Alger Hiss, and was very much considered by that sort of anti-communist wing and by the isolationist wing as being, too soft on communism. And it kind of sticks because, he took this conciliatory position towards the Russians initially. He took a conciliatory position towards the Chinese to try to pull them away from the Russians. The truth of the matter, that, or at least what is being presented here, and presumably in his own memoirs, which of course are going to be favorable to his own view, was more of a picture of, a real politic. I gotta swap batteries. Of the nature, not of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but the enemy of my enemy shouldn't be my enemy too. I shouldn't be picking fights everywhere, is kind of the thing. And in fact, someone, again, not really basing too much on the ideological side of things, but more worried about the actual structure of the piece, etc. A lot of things that he wanted to do didn't end up happening, especially early on. So, he wanted reunification of Germany, and was willing early on to not have a military power in Germany, but very quickly started turning away from that as he became more and more anti-Soviet there, and because the Soviets wanted a neutered Germany, and Acheson was coming up with his plan for NATO and what kind of troops would be needed and what kind of defense positions would be needed. And without West Germany, he didn't see how Europe could hold up. That they absolutely needed a Germany that's integrated into Europe. And obviously, Russia's not going to give East Germany over and blah, blah, blah. So, and a number of other circumstances of that sort. But yeah, he stood fairly hard on containment and stuff like that, but things like Korea, he didn't specifically mention Korea, which was divided into North and South already right after the war, and that was seen by his critics as being sort of a green light for Russia to instigate North Korea's intervention. And just stuff along those lines, where he didn't put that under the containment umbrella, and by not doing that, he was almost responsible for the Korean War, was kind of the argument that the critics make. The author doesn't really push against Acheson for that. He seems to sort of make it as, oh, well, this was just sort of an oversight. Yeah, well, oversights have implications, and in his case, I think this one, I think there's an argument to be made about it. But of course, we don't know at this point. Nobody wrote down, none of the Soviet or North Korean leaders wrote down, yeah, well, the American Secretary of State left the Korean Peninsula off, so we're free to take it, right? But yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that weren't listed, South America wasn't listed, etc. Acheson was very much focused on the European solution and saw Europe as sort of the key to the world coming forward, although he was also involved in the Japanese and the rebuilding there and whatnot, and in pushing MacArthur towards something that was less having trouble finding words, less of a punishment for the Japanese, and also he was partially involved in the decision making that allowed MacArthur to fuck up completely in Korea. Like, MacArthur, great World War II war hero. MacArthur is such an interesting figure. I ought to be reading a biography of him, but I don't have one kicking around. But yeah, he's such an interesting figure because, Roosevelt considered him the most dangerous man in America before the war. And just, his political connections and whatnot, in addition to his sort of whole delusions of grandiosity, maybe not delusions, I don't know, where you get the feeling, at least I've gotten the feeling, that MacArthur was like, a little Napoleon waiting to happen, was kind of the view that many had. And he set himself up with his own little empire in the Philippines before the war, and all kind of weird shit there. But when, here he is, an old man, and he goes in, is in charge in Korea, has a stunning turnaround up to the Incheon landings and everything, just drives. Now, if you watch my game on Korean War, or if you're up on the history there, honestly, the North Koreans overextended to a point where they kind of couldn't have taken more. But it looked like they were going to take everything, And so yeah, once they started facing real resistance, and once troops started hitting back, they just collapsed back across the border, and there was nothing to defend that. And now the Truman administration, and Acheson was somewhat involved in these orders as well, at least in advising for him, more or less gave MacArthur a free hand. The one exception was U.S. troops weren't supposed to be used beyond a certain point. And had MacArthur stopped at that point, Chinese probably wouldn't have been involved, but if they had, the U.S. could have held that line. But instead, where they went, 38th parallel or whatever, they ended up, they ended up having to fall back to basically the starting position and then get nothing but a ceasefire. But yeah, I mean, MacArthur thought, hey, we're the best country, the most powerful country in the world. We can win. He also didn't think the Chinese were going to come in. And honestly, the U.S. as a whole didn't think the Chinese were going to come in. But you get to see a picture of sort of MacArthur's reaction, which is really, really not very flattering to him. Basically, he took the kind of reaction that I take to bad things in life, and you get the feeling of him kind of just curling up in a ball and crying and wishing the world wouldn't treat him badly or something. I don't know. Now, again, maybe he would have been better at an earlier age. He was an old man, and maybe seeing his career fall apart. But then, his whole, we should nuke China type of attitude and everything, it was very clear that he was too much of a loose cannon, which everybody knew before that anyhow. But, and relieving of him of command, Acheson was involved in that decision. He was involved in a lot of the decision making. With later administrations, he was often brought in as kind of an advisory role, and apparently, he had a very strong way of presenting his case for whatever he's arguing. He was also a lawyer and pretty effective as such. So yeah, I mean, it was interesting to read something about someone from that period who had so many links to so much stuff that was going on, and it's just sort of a wow. He was just one of the many names that sort of flows around from that period. I'm thinking like Avril Harriman as well from there and whatnot. And it's just not a period I've looked at or studied much, so it's kind of neat to see this kind of view into it and see all the other people that, are names that I recognize and know what they did, more or less, but not really. What's kind of funny, so he's Dean Acheson. His first name is Dean. That's a name that's kind of gone out of popularity, but it was pretty damn popular at that time because the next Democratic Secretary of State was Dean Rusk, who, again, doesn't get a very good picture painted of him here. And then you got, like, Dean Martin at the same time, too. But I'm, like, trying to think of anybody named Dean now, and I can't think of anyone, which reminded me of quite a few years back, the name Gary. Apparently, there were almost none christened in the U.S. Now, Gary was a really, really common name, I thought. Not huge, not like John, but, up there with like Frank or whatever, or Jeff. It was just something you got used to hearing. And apparently it's just gone completely out of favor for some reason. And it's just kind of weird when you start thinking about that. Like, this must have been Dean must have been a fairly common name. Anyway, I'm just babbling on to babble. And my tea's almost out, so I guess it's time, and my battery's not charging over there. I guess it's time to say goodbye on this one. I don't know what value these have, but I do them because I don't play enough, I guess.